Good morning, my fellow humans. You all know Mary, and you all know that you have to, she has such a wonderful ability to make sometimes commonplace things seem enormously important, and she generates tremendous enthusiasm in everything she touches. And it's been such a joy and a pleasure to know her as a friend and colleague over these many years. I look forward to a lot more time working with you, Mary, and thank you for your leadership. Thank you so much for your leadership in this organization. Câmara Phyllis Jones, MD, MPH, PhD, Senior Fellow of the Satcher Health Leadership Institute, Morehouse School of Medicine, President, not president-elect anymore, but president of the American Public Health Association. Such a wonderful opportunity and such an appropriate person to lead that organization. As a teacher, her allegories on race and racism illuminate topics that are otherwise difficult for many Americans to understand or to discuss. She hopes, through her work, to initiate a national conversation on racism that will eventually lead to a national campaign against racism, something that's sorely needed. And what a rich and powerful background she has to do this. She received her bachelor's in molecular biology from Wellesley College, her MD from the Stanford University School of Medicine, and both her Master of Public Health and her PhD degree in epidemiology from the Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health. She also completed residency training in both general preventive medicine at Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health and family practice at a residency done with the program in social medicine at Montefiore Hospital. Dr. Jones was an assistant professor at the Harvard School of Public Health and from 1994 to the year 2000, and from the year 2000 to the year 2014, a medical officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from the years 2000 to 2014. You know, it's really, really, really great fun to introduce a speaker whom you know will wow the audience. It gives me great pleasure to do that. It's great fun also. And she is indeed, Câmara Jones, you are indeed, and I've heard you several times over the years, an excellent scholar, a skilled communicator, and the quintessential teacher. Just listen.
Thank you, Dr. White, and good morning to everyone. First of all, I have to apologize. I raced from Los Angeles, where I was speaking yesterday morning, to be here this morning, and my bags didn't make it. So normally I would be a little bit more spiffed up to come and address you all, but these are my travel clothes, so here it is. Here we are, right? And I also am delighted to say that so now I have I have on a lavalier too, so I don't want to interfere with this mic. Maybe for the mic people, maybe I'll use the podium mic until I start walking, because I'm getting a lot of feedback. I also wanted to say, Dr. White, that now as president of the American Public Health Association, I don't have to aim to start a national conversation on racism that will result in a national campaign against racism. I announced last week at the APHA meeting that I am going to be taking APHA and as many other partners as will join us on a national campaign against racism. So this is my bully pulpit. So that is what we're going to do, but I can't do that by myself. So we're going to need all of our partners across the nation, because if we announce such an effort in this time with such pressing and I would say obvious need to people who would just read the news, and then we fail, then we'll be 3 steps back. So this can't be Camara's push or even just the American Public Health Association's push. This has to be an all hands on deck push to name racism, ask how is racism operating here, and to organize and strategize to act. So I'm going to give us some tools this morning, some communication tools, allegories on race and racism that will equip us to start these often difficult conversations. Then I'm going to be one of 4 workshops from 9 to 11 where we can dig a little deeper, and I'll be doing some data stuff and giving some other tools. But for right now, this is going to be all about communication tools through storytelling. It's described as being a session from 8 to 8:45 with 15 minutes of question and answer, but I would like to invite your interruptions, your challenges, your amens throughout the thing. So we're just going to go from 8 to 9 with continuous conversation, if that's all right. So I'm first going to start talking not explicitly about racism, but about levels of health intervention so that we can frame why a group that's interested in arthritis and musculoskeletal diseases, a group that's interested in public health, a group that's interested in obesity, why any of us in the health enterprise might even say the word racism in relation to our work. So here we go. Whoops! Boom! Oh, this thing doesn't go very fast. Boom! Okay. Boom! Somebody has just fallen off of the cliff of good health. And if that were you, or if it were somebody in your family, you would be delighted to find an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff to speed you on to care. But if we were concerned about others who might come along that cliff face, if we were concerned about community health, or population health, or public health, we might very well ask ourselves, what can we put in place as a health intervention besides just stationing lots of ambulances at the bottom of the cliff? So somebody in the room is going to say, I know, let's put a net halfway down, right? Because at least if people fall, we can catch them before they get crunched up at the bottom. That is an excellent idea. Although, nets have holes in them, so some people might fall through the cracks. But even so, we could maybe put a trampoline halfway down. No holes in a trampoline. But even if we have a trampoline halfway down that cliff, we might find ourselves with lots of people just bouncing up at half functionality, not able to get back to the top of the cliff. So what else could we put in place as a health intervention? Well, clearly we need to think about a fence, right? Everybody's like, yeah, you should have thought of that first. But okay. But okay, so now we're going to have our fence to keep people from falling in the first place. But as good an idea as that is, that's going to have to be a very, very strong fence if there's a lot of population pressure against it. So what else can we do as a health intervention? We can move the population away from the edge of the cliff. I'm going to label the interventions that I've described so far so we'll have a clearer understanding of what I'm talking about. The ambulance at the bottom of the cliff represents medical care and what we in public health describe as tertiary prevention. We describe 3 levels of prevention: primary, secondary, tertiary, where tertiary prevention is preventing the complications from disease that's already manifest. For diabetes, it's preventing the amputations and the like. The net or trampoline halfway down, these are our safety net programs. Secondary prevention, which is about early detection, screening. The fence at the edge of the cliff is about primary prevention, keeping things from happening in the first place. Movement is life, And moving the population away from the edge of the cliff is about addressing the social determinants of health. These social determinants of health being the determinants of health and illness that are outside of the individual. They're beyond our genes. They're beyond our individual behaviors, and they are, in fact, the context in which our behaviors arise and have meaning. Neighborhood context, like not having fresh fruits and vegetables in your neighborhood, or having no sidewalks on which to work in, or no bike lanes, or having no street lights and having it dangerous to even get out and walk at night. Neighborhood contexts like no jobs or poor educational systems, individual poverty, and poverty in your community. So if we were talking about infant mortality, for example, then the ambulance might be neonatal intensive care units, the net or trampoline might be, our prenatal care, early detection of problems. The fence might be women, infants, and children, nutritional supplementation. And moving the population away from the edge of the cliff might be excellent educational opportunities so that young girls didn't have babies so soon. So in each, we could think about for musculoskeletal disorders, the ambulance is, when you're finally getting, a knee replacement or something like that. The net or the trampoline might be screening programs and kind of getting physical therapy types of things. The fence, what would the fence be? I guess movement, really. Movement is life. And moving the population might be efforts that would even decrease obesity. Fresh fruits and vegetables in a neighborhood that would decrease obesity and the like. And you guys can throw in your examples for here. So you see, it's a good tool. We could take sometimes I take these things and I look at like the Healthy People 2020 goals and say, where do they fall on the fence? Or we could go into a community and say, how should we be spending our resources? We could go to Congress and we could say, how should we spend our health resources? We know we need an ambulance and a net and a fence, but really shouldn't we be spending most of our resources in moving the population away from the edge of the cliff? But as useful as this diagram might be, so far it has a fatal flaw. Because so far, this diagram does not talk about how health disparities arise. So now, I want you to keep this cliff in the back of your mind. We're going to shift gears for just a moment to think about how health disparities arise, and then we'll come back to the cliff. So how do health disparities arise? Well, especially when you're talking about racial ethnic health disparities, we unfortunately have lots of evidence about differences in the quality of care received within the healthcare system. The Institute of Medicine, way back now in 2002, released its unequal treatment report that pulled together hundreds of studies at that time, talking about differences even in how vigorously your chest pain might be investigated, depending on your race. How vigorously your evident signs of coronary artery disease might be treated. The differences in how much pain medication you might get walking into an emergency department with a long bone fracture, depending on your ethnicity or your race. But that panel, which was just considering, are there differences looking at everybody in the VA system or looking at everybody covered by Medicare or Medicaid, that panel says that is not the only thing that's going on. So they acknowledged a second level at which health disparities arise, differences in access to that system in the first place. But now all of us in this room, I think, must recognize that health is not created within the health sector, right? It's not created in our clinics, in our offices. And so there's a huge third level at which health disparities arise, which are the differences in the conditions of our lives. The differences in our life opportunities, exposures, and stresses that are making some individuals and communities sicker than others in the first place. And if you think about these three levels at which health disparities arise, differences in quality of care, differences in access to care, and differences in underlying exposures and opportunities, really it's like a pyramid. Or I would say even better, it's more like an iceberg, and the huge hidden base are the differences in the quality of our lives. And then you have those people who've been made sicker, often the very same ones that are frustrated because of limited access to the healthcare system. And then even the lucky ones who get into the system are sometimes further injured because of differences in quality of care. So now thinking about these three levels at which health disparities arise, we're going to go back to our cliff. But now we're going to recognize that we're really not dealing with a flat two-dimensional cliff, but actually we're dealing with a three-dimensional cliff. And at some parts of the cliff, there's an ambulance there, but maybe that ambulance has a flat tire, so it's slow or goes off in the wrong direction. Or maybe there's no ambulance there at all, and maybe there's no net nor fence, and usually at those parts of the cliff, the population is being pushed closer to the edge. So now I'm going to label the observations about this three-dimensional cliff with how health disparities arise, where the differences in quality of care, that's when the ambulance is there, but it slower goes off in the wrong direction. Differences in access to care are no ambulance, no net, no fence. And differences in underlying exposures and opportunities are represented by the closer proximity of that greeny population to the edge. So now that we recognize that we're dealing with a three-dimensional cliff, there's a whole new set of questions that arise. The first question, of course, being how did the cliff become three-dimensional in the first place? And that's usually because of historical injustices that are being perpetuated by present-day contemporary structural factors. But given that the cliff is three-dimensional, we also need to ask, why are there differences in how resources are distributed along that cliff face? And why are there differences in who's found at different parts of the cliff? Why are the oranges back here in a way and the greenies being pushed closer to the edge? And when you ask and address those kinds of questions, you are now doing something that differs from addressing the social determinants of health, which was about moving the population away from the edge of the cliff. You're now addressing the social determinants of equity, which are systems of power that can distribute resources in populations and include things like racism, sexism, heterosexism, economic systems like capitalism and the like. So now with this cliff, I've actually distilled 3 different dimensions of health intervention. If you go back to your junior high or high school geometry, 1 dimension is a line, 2 dimensions is a flat plane, 3 dimensions is space. Well, that first dimension, the line at the edge of the cliff, is where we can display all of our health services. Our curative and preventive health services are all right there. This is what most people think of when you say health. People will complete that thought for you and go to health care. Health services. This is where the Affordable Care Act is. This is where all of our efforts to improve access, all of that is right here. And we have a very important effort going on in this country. I think the final goal is universal access to high-quality health care. I think that all of us would endorse that kind of notion. That's a very important goal. But that goal is not important because that, in and of itself, will result in large and sustained improvements in health outcomes or eliminate health disparities, because we already know that you can overwhelm any system, as universal as the access is and as high quality as the care is. We want universal access to high quality health care because that's how a civilized society values all of its people equally. That's why we want that. But we also recognize if everybody's crowded up against the edge of that fence, we'll overwhelm any system. We must move into that second dimension, which we can display in a flat plane and move the population away from the edge of the cliff. That is, we have to address social determinants of health like poverty, adverse neighborhood conditions, and the like, if we're going to have large and sustained improvements in health outcomes. But here's the trick there. If we don't recognize that we are dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff, we are actually at risk of moving some of the population away from the edge of the cliff and not all of the population, and actually making health disparities worse. So we must acknowledge and address the 3-dimensionality of the cliff by addressing social determinants of equity like racism, sexism, heterosexism, and the like. If we want to achieve social justice and eliminate health disparities, that is, we have to move all of the population away from the edge of the cliff and make sure that resources are equitably distributed throughout if we want to get to that final goal. At this point, I would like to invite at least one or two questions, because I want to make sure, first of all, that we're all on the same page, because this is my rationale, besides the fact that race, well, we'll go into other rationales, but this is how I introduce the notion that people involved in the health enterprise need to be involved with power. So any questions? In fact, I'm going to stand here and wait until at least I get one question. So. Yes, Dr. White.
Mark, let me respectfully return to a very brief and important dialogue that you had at a very important meeting with Lou Sullivan.
Wait, Ms. Bruton's bringing a mic.
I'm saying I'd like to respectfully take you back to a brief dialogue that you had with Lou Sullivan, which really has stuck in my mind, at a meeting around a table of lots of people concerned about this.
Yes.
And the challenge was that you said, okay, we're going to make racism an issue, and we're going to do just what we're talking about, what you're doing right now as we speak.
Right.
And Dr. Sullivan says, whoa, wait a minute, slow down a little bit. And I think the essence, and I don't want to think for him, but I believe the essence of it is that people get turned off, they run the other direction, they get upset and they get nervous when you say racism. Would you comment on that? Would you take your side of that equation?
I will take my side of that, and the rest of this whole talk is my side of that. But basically, if we understand that racism is not an individual indictment, that when we say the word racism, we are not trying to sort the world into racist and non-racist in this country, because basically racism is a system that if any of us are in this system long enough, which in this country is 1 year, if you've been in this country for 1 year, then you have some racism in you somewhere, and I'm going to talk about that. We're not saying, are you racist or are you not? We're saying we are all in a racist system, and this is a problem for all of us. So I'm going to provide a definition for racism that will be good. But I liken it to racism as a cement factory that is spewing cement dust. And if you are anywhere in the environs of this cement factory for just a minute, you're going to have cement dust in your lungs, right? Most of the cement dust I have in my lungs might be internalized. You know, it might be against people, me and myself, but all of us are going to have cement dust in our lungs. If we recognize that we have this cement factory spewing cement dust, first of all, to protect ourselves as individuals, we might want to put on a gas mask, but even that is doing something that's actively anti-racist. That is, we have to acknowledge that the cement factory is there, that it is poisoning all of us, and as an individual, we might start doing something actively anti-racist, putting on that gas mask. But then the job is not just for us to do that for ourselves, but we need to, all of us, start putting on our gas mask and then work to shut down the factory. And so that is what I'm about. We cannot shut down that factory unless we name it as a problem. And we will continue to be poisoned, and our children coming up and our children coming up will be continue to be poisoned until we say there is a cement factory going on here, it is spewing cement dust, and we have to make it our business to shut it down. So that is the thing. I believe that as charged as the term racism might seem to people, my allegories that I'm going to now present are effective communication tools that can start conversations. Because we're going to now start talking about racism, not between you and me, but we're going to talk about flower pots. Or we're going to talk about signs in a restaurant. We're going to talk about other things where everybody can have a shared experience, get insight from that shared experience, and then take it back to our lives. Is that good? Any other questions or comments?
Yes.
Yes.
If I may, just one point that I'm trying to get my head around. So much of our mission is in trying to empower individuals and to liberate them to make their own decisions. And yet everything you've said, from what I can see in your diagrams, is sort of about herding or about us being superior and directing them away from the cliff, those poor people. It's not about empowerment. It's not about removing the oppressor,
right.
but basically the oppression of the system, which is stopping us from realizing ourselves.
So I heard then just two questions.
This is in a sort of an institutional public health. We're speaking a lot in the terminology of victimology and those poor oppressed people, and we'll herd them away from the cliff. I don't hear much about the liberation of their individuality and their freedom to decide for themselves, shackled by this sort of oppressive system.
So I'm going to take your question as a question about the role of the individual in all of this, and have I overlooked the role of the individual and the power that an individual has and a sense of individual efficacy?
In terms of the goal ultimately being to liberate those individuals to make good choices for themselves.
So I would say that individuals, that in our society, there are individuals and there are structures and there are systems. And in our society, I would say we have a very strong focus on the individual, and we are almost blind to structures and systems.
Correct.
So all of it is happening. But sometimes, so the question might be, why, are those green people throwing themselves off the cliff, for example?
The question is, I hope you're not losing sight of the individuals because you've not mentioned it yet. It's very much in terms of victims and our superior,
it's not
our
about
superior
victims.
Role in being able to help them, those people.
No, it's so I am going to talk about how people get close to the cliff or not.
Right.
So it's not our superior role, but it is about systems and structures. So we would say, if we were to query this room about what causes any illness, we get a list of individual behaviors, right? We would query any any group of people. We would be talking about diet, we'd be talking about exercise, we'd be talking about smoking or not, we'd be talking about alcohol intake, drugs or not, sleep, safe sex. We'd be talking about a lot of individual behaviors, and that's because individual behaviors do matter, right? So it does matter what you put in your mouth. But then we might have to ask a why question.
Yes,
and the why question is, why do certain people put certain things in their mouths and other people put other things in their mouths? And once you ask that why question, you have to broaden your focus, your singular gaze on individual behaviors to now also encompass the context in which those behaviors arise, which in public health we're now calling the social determinants of health. So now you have to say, well, is it because they're living in a fast food swamp or a food desert? Is it, they have no access to fresh fruits and vegetables. They can't walk. There are no gym clubs. It's not safe to go out in the neighborhood. They can't do those things. So then we say, okay, so in order to be effective in getting them to do whatever it is that they need to do to stay healthy, we have to teach them about individual behaviors, but we also need to address the context. But then we have to ask another why question. The second why question is the one that we often do not ask, which is, because it doesn't just so happen that some people find themselves in food deserts and other people find themselves next to Whole Foods, whole paycheck, right? Okay, so that is not just a happenstance. So when we ask that second question, why do we see the range of contexts that we see here in DC or in any of our cities or in this country? Why do we see that range of contexts? And why do we see the distribution of populations into those contexts that we see? We are now broadening our gaze, first of all, past the individual to the context, then to the social determinants of context, which are these social determinants of equity. So in order to be effective, we have to talk to the people about what they put in their mouths. We must address the context, but we must also address those decision-making processes that decide whether or not you are going to have a Whole Foods or a farmer's market or whatever in your neighborhood. Those decision-making processes are part of the mechanisms of racism, sexism, and the like.
Right.
So I'm not trying to overlook the individual, but I guess what I'm doing is highlighting what we as a nation often do not acknowledge, because we have such an inordinate, I would say, focus on the individual, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and like, that systems and structures are often invisible to us. We would rather investigate genes and think about gene therapy than acknowledge that if we were to invest in education, then we could have a lot better situation.
Thank you.
Your response? I don't know if you want to go in.
We could go on.
We could go back and forth, but anyway, so
I'm sure we have other things to cover.
Okay,
thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. I see one more question. Hey,
good morning, Dr. Jones. Randall Morgan. I wanted you to comment on the model and the context in which we see the model, because it sounds as if the context is representative of our situation in this country. So that is there a way to adapt the model to the international experiences with regard to health and healthcare delivery, and say if we did have a perfect world and had universal health care, what would the model look like? Would there be some other dimensions or slopes or things like that would inform the model?
Right. Well, so I think that the basic model stands. I mean, we do have some countries that have more robust fences and nets. We have some countries that invest in strong social security and, around children and families and the like, so their population starts a little bit back further from the cliff. But I think that the thing about sloping and the like is the thing I haven't introduced yet, which one might consider to be strong social security, could make it not such a cliff, but could make it slopey, and also environmental intervention. So now that we think about global climate change and the like, what we're doing is we're making the cliff even more of a sharp cliff for all of us. I mean, maybe we're shortening the distance. Maybe the cliff is eroding and getting closer to all of us with global climate change. But I think in general, the notion that there are these different dimensions that we can address, in some countries there has been more investment in some parts than others. I think when I think about World Bank and stuff like that, that they might, I don't know, maybe national countries that, and in our US country, we focus so much on the ambulance. We are so proud of our excellent health care, even though a lot of people can't even get to that ambulance, right? Or they're lying down beside the ambulance, I mean, there's no access. So I think, in my mind, I mean, I would welcome your embellishments on it, but I think that the elements of the health enterprise are pretty well laid out here. So, but I certainly embellish, if you will.
No, I just thought it would be something to think about in the future because particularly looking at the worldwide situation, we're so impacted by that situation that it may be informative.
Thank you very much. And I think what happens in the worldwide situation is basically the difference in investment at different levels and how close or how far the population is away from the edge of the cliff. Yes?
I just have a simple burning question that you probably are going to cover. But your model, I love. As we move those, that group back and that we talk about addressing determinants of health and equity, I want to know where the barriers to their care. I had the privilege of spending several months in medical school in the UK, and I saw the duality of their system, sort of the universal care that everybody talks about, and we talk about we're going to have universal care here, but then our consultants left in the afternoon and went to their lucrative private practice, and they cared for a whole nother group that we never talk about in this country. So as we've moved those people back, and we provided them sort of this open access, there's still sort of these barriers that exist to care that are going to divide that group, provider biases and the biases that exist that are going to keep them from maybe getting the care they want. How does that fit into the model? And how does that barrier prevent us from getting health equity?
So it might be that you would think in the UK that the national health system, you might feel that it's more of a net than the ambulance, and that the people who, well, I don't know. Or maybe it's a stronger net or a faster ambulance. It sounds to me, the difference between their system and what we have here is that we don't have a US healthcare system. We have systems and gaps. So we don't even have one system. So I, long time ago, decades ago, also went for a summer to study the national health system. I'm sure it's evolved since I was there. But I was impressed that everybody at least had rudimentary access to basic things. And then if you wanted the bells and whistles or a shorter line or whatever, then you would, now I think, go outside of the system. In our country, we don't even guarantee that basic access to everything yet. We tried to with the Affordable Care Act, but when the Supreme Court said that states could opt out of Medicaid expansion, then I, for example, live in Georgia, which is one of 29, I think, still states that did not expand Medicaid, and these are the states that need it the most. So I would say that those kinds of systems where you have that duality of care, what you've done is you've at least raised the floor a little bit. So that you're guaranteeing at least basic access so that people can get primary care, that they're not showing up in emergency departments at the last minute or showing up in emergency departments with things that are not urgent issues. That you're sort of taking the stress off of the system and then recognizing that some people want to be able to buy better things. So that's happening, but what we have is an ambulance at just a few parts of the cliff and lots of parts of the cliff that still aren't there. And I guess what they're doing is stationing the ambulances more evenly and then having a backup ambulance or a helicopter at some parts of the cliff as well. I guess that's how I would describe it. Yes, Mickey.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. Coming from England and having lived through the NHS system, it's a flawed system. However, there's a different consciousness around community and how we fund community. America is built on this individualism that permeates everything that we do. Elections are won and lost on taxes. Now, I'm used to contributing 33% of my wages because I know that my children have free education and my mother has free healthcare. And there's all this gray in between, but that the most vulnerable parts of the population are most certainly taken care of. And it's a great system. And they have, yes, in the last 20, 30 years, introduced a pay-for system. And only those who can pay for will get more. But there is a much higher raised level because there is this different consciousness around what is acceptable in terms of healthcare. And I believe that our country, the US, will make it there to universal healthcare, but there needs to be a shift in consciousness around what is important as a community and a shift away from individualistic thinking because the social determinants of health are real. and they are the direction, they take the direction of people's lives based on the color of your skin or your educational level, where you live. And we can't ignore this anymore. This has to be the discussion that we're having. Even as I operate a clinic where I deal one-on-one with individuals every day, I have to look to see why are my clients more privileged here and not so much over here. I have to take that into account as I counsel them. I cannot just deal with, you know, their low back problems or their post-traumatic stress or their, you know, sexual abuse problem. How did that come to be? And so when I counsel them outside of just their individual decisions to help them think about the wider picture and that they're not alone.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to
Yes,
make that comment.
Thank you very much. So now, thank you all for such a robust conversation with my request for one question. So now we're going to shift into the allegories that are specifically on race and racism. And so I need to define racism. We've said the word now a few times, but what do I mean when I say that racism? When I was discussing with Dr. White, I sort of gave you a clue to this, but I am talking about a system. I'm not talking about an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing, or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. It's a system of power. And it's a system of doing what? It's a system of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured? And on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race in this country. Now, you look at me here in DC, and I'm clearly black. But if you were to look at me in some parts of Brazil, I would be just as clearly white. If you were to look at me in South Africa, I would be clearly colored. So here I am with the same physical appearance, but the social interpretation of my appearance in those three settings would assign me to three different racial groups. And furthermore, if I were to stay in any of those settings long enough, then my health outcome would probably take on that of the group to which I've been assigned, even though I'd have the same genes in all three places. And what we think of as so clear, you know, you can look at somebody and just know what their race is clear if we've been grown up in this country, but if people come from other countries, they're trying to figure out how do we make these distinctions, right? So race, first of all, and I'm going to share an allegory about that, but race is not something biological. It's a social construct, and racism is that system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on so-called race. Now, what are the impacts of this system? Well, when we in this country think or talk about racism at all, we do finally get to the fact that it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. But it doesn't take very long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism also unfairly advantages other individuals and communities. And that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about. It's difficult, but it's real. And I have an allegory on that too. But even as we recognize, okay, we have a system that's either unfairly disadvantaging or unfairly advantaging individuals and communities, racism is sapping the strength of our whole society through the waste of human resources. I could give you many examples of that, but I'm just going to lift up two. The first is how the blinders of racism have made us as a nation not be all about vigorously investing in the full, excellent public education of all of our kids. The blinders of racism make us believe there's no genius in the barrios or in the ghettos or on the reservations. We can get along very well, thank you, without those kids. But of course, we know that there's genius in all of our communities. And if we were to fully and vigorously invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation, or even as a world. I often say that we would already be up on Mars farming if that were a good idea to do, if we were to invest in all of this genius. Another example of how these blinders of racism that make us not value everybody in this country equally impacts us is how it's made us complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many black and brown men in our prison system, as if that did not separate us from human potential. And if you know somebody who's either in the prisons or cycling in and out, coming out with a felony conviction, can't vote in most states, can't get a job, can't get public housing, no other way but to go back in, you know that there are many geniuses that are caught up in this, that if we had only invested in their education, for example, they would be contributing very productively to our society. I actually think that lifting up how racism saps the strength of the whole society may be the most important bullet on that slide. It's important to call out the disadvantage and its reciprocal advantage. But when we understand that truly, however we're being affected as an individual, that racism is sapping the strength of all of us, then more of us might become engaged with a sense of urgency to dismantle this system and to put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. I think that's where our data collection needs to be, our media stories, and our conversations around our dinner tables. But then you might say, well, how could racism turn into a health outcome? And to understand that, I talk about racism on 3 levels: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. So I'm going to define each of these levels, illustrate, give you examples of how they can impact health, and then illustrate them with my Gartner's tail allegory. So institutionalized racism is that system of structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that results in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that does not require an identifiable perpetrator. This is the kind of racism that's institutionalized in our laws and in our norms and the like. And it often manifests, it often shows up as inherited disadvantage or its reciprocal inherited advantage. We see it in terms of material conditions and in terms of access to power. So examples include differential access to quality housing or equal educational opportunities or equal employment opportunities, or even the same level of income at the same level of employment, and these things impact health. Differential access to medical facilities, including even linguistic access to medical facilities. Differential access to a clean environment, and the whole well-documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites or bus transfer stations in communities of color. In terms of information, differential access to health information, or even information about our own histories, and this is a sense of, this is power. Differential access to resources, not just capital resources, but social networking resources, knowing somebody on the board, knowing somebody with admitting privileges to that institution. Differential access to power as voice, voice in government, voice in media, and the like. Now, I'm going to preempt a question right here, because in the past, people have stopped me about here and said, well, Dr. Jones, look at that top bullet there about housing, education, employment, income. Why do you have that on a slide about racism? Isn't that what we really call social class? Are you talking about racism or are you talking about social class? That's a very important question. And many of you in this room are like, okay, so what are you going to say about that? I am going to start addressing that question with the observation that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized, oppressed, stigmatized group of color, there's been some initial historical insult. So, for example, for American Indians, it was the taking of the land and the near genocide, and then the moving of the survivors to reserved lands, reservations. And then in some instances, something good was found under that land. Oops, got to move them again. For people who were in Mexico, is when parts of Mexico became New Mexico, and Arizona, and California, you know, and people still being stigmatized who've been there for centuries, right? For people of African descent, it started with the kidnapping of West African people, and then our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors and their progeny, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then people might go, oh, Dr. Jones, there you go, slavery. Oh, you know, it was. People said, you know, slavery was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history. But Dr. Jones, the enslaved people were emancipated in 1865. And we're in 2015. So that's fully 150 years ago. So all else being equal, Dr. Jones, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase there is all else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And for each of these historical injustices, there are contemporary structural factors, present-day structural factors in our laws and policies and the like that are perpetuating those initial historical injustices. So when people ask me, are you talking about racism or are you really talking about social class? I say that institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. And that's a very important aha. Because I'm not saying we shouldn't address poverty. If you gave me a magic wand today to eliminate poverty, boom, 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 done, I would do it. I would go further. I would eliminate income inequality. That's a bit of a radical stance, but I would do it, right? But if I did that without addressing the background structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that were put in place to differentially shunt different populations into different possibilities, if I did not address those mechanisms of institutionalized racism, even if I equalized income today, within 20 years, we would start to see a stratification by race in terms of social class again. You get that? It's an important observation. So we have to do both, right? But we must, if we want to achieve racial social justice, address the mechanisms of institutionalized racism, which are our structures, the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, who's at the table and who's not, what's on the agenda and what's not, our policies, which are the written how of decision-making, our practices and norms, which are the unwritten how of decision-making, and our values, which are the why. Now, before I leave institutionalized racism, I also need to say that it can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission, and very often institutionalized racism shows up as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. This is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and the different action, the discrimination. How could that impact health? Well, police brutality. I used to talk about being pulled over for driving while black or driving while Latino, and being interpreted as resisting arrest and hit upside your head. Now I can just give you a litany of well-known names, like Mike Brown and Freddie Gray and Tamir Rice and Sam DuBose, and Trayvon Martin wasn't even a police officer. It was a self-appointed neighborhood watchman and the like. So we are very well aware now of how police brutality can impact not only the health of individuals, but of communities that love those individuals and fear for their families. Physician disrespect, it can be as subtle as a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because a physician figures, well, that patient wouldn't understand or couldn't afford or wouldn't comply or whatever they assume. Or it could be quite blatant, like sterilization abuse, which has had many iterations in our nation's history. Shopkeeper vigilance, being followed around in stores, or waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatment. And these are just two examples of what some people call everyday racism, the microaggressions, that the subtle communication of disrespect that might even be related to elevated blood pressures in communities of color, blood pressures that don't even go down at night. Teacher devaluation, that's a very important manifestation of personally mediated racism. Because if a teacher looks at a young child and thinks, that child can't learn, and puts that child off in the ADD track, that child will never even know their full potential, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. Now, personally mediated racism, like institutionalized, can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. But even more important is that it can be unintentional, as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism, internalized racism, I define as acceptance by members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. Here I'm speaking from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races. And I actually have friends who do anti-racism training who said, well, Kamara, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people are walking around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? And I have to acknowledge that it is. I'm not talking about that right now. So right now, I put that off in my background normative stuff in terms of institutionalized. So right now, I'm speaking about the impacts of internalized racism from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races. And here, the impacts come through self-devaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as, maybe I shouldn't graduate from high school, or apply to that college, or apply for that job, or try to live in that neighborhood. And this self-devaluation also turns into fratricide, black on black or Latino on Latino crime, because if you don't value yourself, you won't value somebody who looks just like you, and you just as soon off them as not. The white man's ISIS Colder syndrome, that phraseology came from my parents' generation. And what it meant then and what it still means today for many people of color is say that you're black and you need a lawyer. You might actually go and look for a white lawyer over a black lawyer. Or if you needed a doctor, you might seek out a white doctor over a black doctor. In fact, if your water was warm, you might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. Resignation, helplessness, hopelessness turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors. The questioner before who was talking about, well, what can we do, what about the individual behavior stuff? Well, this is where a lot of that comes from. Self-destructive health behaviors turns even into not registering to vote or not voting even if you are registered. And basically, internalized racism is about members of stigmatized races accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So that when you hear young high school students of color, one of their friends is trying to be the valedictorian and they are teasing him or her saying, well, so-and-so is just trying to be white, we have to challenge that. Because since when did white people claim exclusive access to excellence? They did not. So now I'm going to illustrate these 3 levels of racism with my Gardener's Tale allegory. All of my allegories are sparked by something I've seen with my own real eyes. So I'm going to tell you first what I saw with my own real eyes, and then we're going to make it a story about racism. So my husband and I, newly married, moved back down to Baltimore so I could finish my PhD at Hopkins, and we bought our first freestanding house with a big, lovely wraparound porch with flower boxes all on this porch. And when we bought the house, it was October, so we weren't even thinking about planting in our flower boxes till spring. But when spring came, we were all excited because this is our cute little house, right? So we run out and we're going to plant marigolds in all of our boxes. And then we see, well, some of the boxes have dirt in them, but some of the boxes are empty. So my husband dutifully goes off to the gardening store, and he comes back hauling big old bags of potting soil, right? And then we fill up the empty boxes, and we take equal numbers of our marigold seeds, and we put them in the boxes, and then we water them. And I'm really not the gardener in the family, so by that time I'd maxed out in terms of my contribution, so I just sit back. So I sit back, going to be delighted. But about 3 weeks later, I'm walking out of my front door onto my porch, and I literally stopped in my tracks looking at those flower boxes because as I looked at them, it looked like we had planted completely different species in some boxes compared to the others. Some of the boxes were full of plants, and those plants were tall and vigorous looking. And some of the boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that my husband had brought turned out to be rich, fertile soil. So that every single seed planted in that rich, fertile soil had sprouted, and the strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old soil that we had found there turned out to be poor, rocky soil, so that the weak seed planted in the poor, rocky soil had just died. And even the strong seed in that poor, rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. And I imagine that there's some gardeners in this audience right now, and maybe you've composted half of your garden. So maybe you've seen this image with your own real eyes, and the image is about the importance of the soil, right? The importance of the environment. But now I'm going to take that image and I'm going to make it a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we have a gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms, and the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil, and the pink seed she throws over in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later in her boxes, she sees what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all of the red seed is sprouted, the strong red seed is strong and vigorous, and even the weak red seed has made it halfway up. In the poor rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died, and here comes a strong pink seed just struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those 2 flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens, and then those flowers go to seed. And year after year, the same thing happens until finally, about 10 years later, the gardener's coming and she's looking at her flower boxes, and she says, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we're going to interrupt the story just for a moment to say that the first part of the story is how institutionalized racism works, where you had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the 2 types of soil, the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But now we're going to pick the story back up and say, okay, well, where is personally mediated racism in this garden? Where the gardener's looking over at red, loving red, and then she looks over at pink and she says, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, so she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, right? Enjoying being red. Many of them not even understanding or acknowledging that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking red is mighty fine and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees. And the bees are just minding their own business, collecting nectar and pollinating, of course. So here comes a bee into one of the pink flowers, and then bzzz to another pink flower, and bzzz to this other pink flower, and that flower's like, get away from me, bee. Do not bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start by addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers, and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that is an important intervention. I am not making light of that as an intervention. But if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you might say, okay, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener. Or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. It's all good. It's good, right? So we have our workshop, and in the workshop we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. I think that if we want to set things right in this garden, we need to address the institutionalized racism. So we either need to break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although in my mind it makes it easier going forward for the gardener to continue to segregate resources. But if you keep separate boxes, it means you have to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious. And remember, they've even been selected for survival and strength, right? They'll be looking great. And then in that intervention, you'll have also addressed the internalized racism, because now the pink and the red flowers looking equally beautiful, pink will no longer be wanting to be red or thinking that red is better. And in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, you will maybe address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener, she may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful will be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism and to very strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we need to at least address the institutionalized racism. Good if we address all the levels at the same time, but at least address the institutionalized racism, and when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. Now, before we leave the story, there's one more huge question that I haven't even raised with you yet, which is, who is the gardener? Because after all, the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which in my mind are the elements of self-determination. Time right now? Oh. Oh, no, I know. That's because I gave you guys so much time to talk before. I shouldn't have done that. I should have just raced through. Anyway, so who is the gardener? Well, this slide used to say, who is the gardener? Government. But I changed my slide when I went to work for CDC. But of course, government. Oh, true that. Right. But government's a huge part of the gardener, but it's not the only part of the gardener. Because
You got 10 more minutes.
10 more.
10 more minutes.
10's good. Okay, so I'm good then. Okay, I'm good in 10 minutes. But you won't be able to ask any more questions. No. But government, but also media, foundations, corporations, communities to the extent that they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink. And it's also dangerous when the gardener is not concerned with equity. When she looks at her flower boxes and thinks that her garden is beautiful, thank you, because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of the garden. And our challenge is what to do about the gardener. Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? You know, do the pink flowers have to grow, recruit their own gardener? Lots of questions that come out of this. I'm going to just share 2 questions that I've heard before that have stayed with me. And then I'm going to just quickly in 5 minutes share the other 3 allegories, and then we might have 4 minutes for questions. But I was once asked, after presenting the gardener's tale, Dr. Jones, excuse me, why should the red flowers share their soil? And I thought, that's a really important question. First of all, it shows the power of this story to start conversations about racism, right? Because if we were talking about racism between you and me, that question would never even come up. But my answer is that, the question being, why should the red flowers share their soil? My answer is that that soil doesn't belong to the red flowers, it belongs to the garden. Now, we can debate that or not, but this allows us to have a conversation like that. The second question, really, observation is, what if that's not the original gardener? What if that's the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild? Here we are. And that child has grown up seeing the pink and red flowers looking like that. What then? How do we crack that nut? And there are 3 steps to cracking that nut. First of all, we have to make the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem, right? And Dr. Thatcher and President Clinton in 1998 made elimination of health disparities an agenda item for the first time. It used to be that in our healthy people plans for the nation, if this was black infant mortality and this was white infant mortality, we were trying to do this. For Healthy People 2010, we tried to do this, eliminate the gap. But we weren't successful. So then the second question is, why weren't we successful? We put a lot of intellectual energy and money into that. And that points out the necessity of making those flower boxes transparent. We have to be talking about the differences in the quality of the soil. And then the third nuance to that is we also have to make it clear that that pink seed didn't just jump over into that poor rocky soil. We have to talk about history, and as a nation, we are typically ahistorical, but we have to talk about history, and we also need to talk about the agency of the gardener in all of this. Okay? So I am very quickly going to just give you a shadow of 3 other allegories. Japanese lanterns, colored perceptions, was sparked by my experience as a medical student. I had gone to a faculty member's garden party. It was lovely. I felt all grown up anyway at this garden party, and we were chitting and chatting and eating, and the garden was festooned with Japanese lanterns and colored light bulbs. And after a while, as the sun set and darkness was falling, I actually was getting a little weary, and I decided to go sit off on the side of the garden and just let the conversation and music wash over me. And so as I sat there, I became fascinated by a group of pink moths. And as I gazed at those moths, just, you know, it was like a Zen thing, I was like, oh, aren't they beautiful? My gaze shifted, and I was like, oh, and look at the green moths over there, and the blue moths there, and isn't it interesting how they're sorting according to their kind? Whoops. Now, you might say, did you really think that, Câmara? I did for a minute. But you realize, because you've seen moths, you know, under a universal light, I could have been in another part of the garden talking about yellow and purple and orange moths. And you recognize there's no such thing as pink or purple or blue or yellow or green or orange moths. Moths are different colors, right? But they're different colors of tan and brown and speckled and splotched. And the colors that I thought I saw, and the colors that we might think we see, are due to the lights by which we look, where those colored lights distort and mask our own true variability. And it got me to thinking about what is race, and how do the racial categories that we construct color our vision of who we are. And this was all about race as a social classification, not a biological descriptor. Race as the social interpretation of how one looks in a race-conscious society. And if you have a society that's putting up red and blue and green lights, black and white, and Asian, and Hispanic, and other, that's what you're going to see. You go to another part of the garden, another part of the world, and you'll see pardo, negro, patu, something else. You go somewhere else, you're going to see something else. But only when we look under a universal light will we really have a true understanding of our full human variability and potential. So this is a little image to tuck away about race as a social construct. Dual reality, a restaurant saga. This also was sparked by my experience as a medical student. I was studying late with some friends. We got hungry. There was no food in the apartment, so we decided to go into town, into Palo Alto, to get some food to eat. So we find a restaurant, and we walk in, and we sit down. We order our food. Food is served, and here we are eating. And it's not a remarkable story yet. But as I sat there eating with my friends, I looked up, and I noticed a sign. And the sign was a profound revelation to me about racism. So you're like, huh, in Palo Alto, what did the sign say? Well, the sign said open. So that's no revelation, right? Except here I am, sitting at the table of opportunity eating, looking up, I see a sign that says open, and I understand something about the two-sided nature of those signs. And I realize that now, in fact, because of the hour, the restaurant is closed, and that hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of the sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food, and eat. And all of a sudden, I understood how racism structures open-closed signs in our society, how racism structures a dual reality, where for those who are inside the restaurant, they don't even know there's a two-sided sign going on. They're sitting at the table of opportunity. They see a sign that says open, and they don't even know there's a two-sided sign going on because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. It's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It's difficult for white people in this country to recognize racism. It's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, except we got a hint of that with Ebola, did we not? But for those on the outside, they're very well aware of the two-sided nature of the sign because it proclaims closed to them, and yet they can look through the window and see people inside eating. And so for those on the inside who say, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I know it's hard to understand that when you only see open. In fact, it's part of your privilege not to have to know about the two-sided nature of the sign. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing. It's an empowering thing. Because if you care anything about the people on the other side of the sign, here you are closer to the restaurant owner. You could say to the owner, why don't you open up your restaurant again? There are hungry people outside. Let them come in. You'll make more money, and oh, the conversations we can have. Or maybe you'll pass food out, or maybe you'll break through the glass or tear down the sign, or whatever you do, but you won't just be sitting there saying, why don't those people just come on in and sit down and eat? Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of the sign. The last story is actually not sparked by my own real experience, but by the image from the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who was the president of Spelman College. In her book, she talks about racism as like being on a conveyor belt, like just, living your life. You're not trying to be racist, right? But racism is all around you. You're inexorably on this conveyor belt going toward racism. But basically, that it's a passive experience. I'm going to take her image about racism, and I'm going to expand on it to talk about how we can become actively anti-racist. So here we are on the conveyor belt, and we're just living our lives, going to work, sending the kids to school, going to church, to our clubs, or whatever, and we're moving through racism and toward racism, and if we only looked up, we would even know that, right? But most people don't look up. They're so involved in their individual lives. And sometimes when people do look up, they might see racism, then they close their eyes, right? They're in denial. And they keep on going. Or somebody might look up and see racism, and then they turn around. But that's all they can do, and they just keep going. They just, maybe they're colorblind. They just want to live their lives, right? But now I am going to, and that's because racism is most often passive. But now I'm going to challenge us. We're on this conveyor belt. We've been moving through and toward racism, and now today, this morning, we look up and we see racism. It does exist. There it is. What are we to do? I challenge us, first of all, to turn around on this conveyor belt and start walking. That is, we have to do something active to become actively anti-racist. And we have to walk at least as fast as the conveyor belt is moving just to stay in the same place, okay? And then what happens when you're walking backwards on a crowded conveyor belt? You start bumping into people, and it becomes uncomfortable for them and uncomfortable for you. But this is your opportunity to do the first of 3 stages of being actively anti-racist, which is to say, hey, do you see where we're going? Do you want to go there? Or will you turn around with me? That is to name racism. And most people will say, just stop, don't bother me, just get out of my way, because most people do not want to be disturbed out of their comfort. But maybe 1 or 2 will turn with you. So now you're 2 or 3 walking backwards on this crowded conveyor belt, and you keep bumping into people, and you keep naming racism and inviting them to turn around with you. And most people will not, but maybe you'll never get 50%, but more and more will. So now as you create a critical mass, now you have enough to get through the crowd and not just stay in the same place. So now, here you go, you keep bumping into people and getting more and more, and you're moving backward, not just away from racism, but toward the motor that is running this system. So now we get to the motor. Oh my God, here it is. And this is our opportunity to do the second of 3 stages of being actively anti-racist, which is to ask the question, how is racism operating here? Looking at structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. And I think I found it. I think it's this lever. So I pull up on the lever, and the system starts stuttering, and oh my God, I got it. But it's a very fancy system. So it reconfigures itself, and it keeps on going. which points out the importance of the third stage of being actively anti-racist. Because me on myself on that lever will never do it. But what we have to do is to organize and strategize to act. So while I'm pulling on this lever, I need you to push that button. And I need you to pull on the pulley. And I need you to spin that dial, and all of us to grab some part of this system. Because I think that working together, we can dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to our full potentials. So these three allegories with which I'm ending: Japanese Lanterns was about race as a social construct, dual reality as racism creating an open-closed sign, a dual reality, and Life on a Conveyor Belt, which urges us to join together and become actively anti-racist. And I thank you very much for your participation with us today. Thank you. No, thank you. Thank you. 5 minutes for questions. We have 5 minutes for questions. Please come to a mic. I see that there are 3 mics. So I'm just going to, I want to hear all of your questions, and then I will try to answer them all in one go. Okay, so I want to hear the questions first, and then I'll answer them all in one go. Yes?
Thank you. Hello? Is this on? Okay. Thank you so much. I think all of us are still staying around because your gospel that you're preaching right now is just so powerful. So thank you. Priyanka Suryo, I'm actually also currently in grad school, Master's of Public Health. So your campaign is already working because we're learning about these very things within class, including your gardener's tale. So thank you. I just want to bring up a notion that I've observed and somewhat experienced within racial ethnic minority groups, is this fascination of the lighter skin colors. So that can be both, internally mediated, like, darker is worse and lighter is better. There's more opportunity for lighter. And then personally mediated with, oh, that person's darker, they're not as good. That person who's lighter, they might be smarter or more beautiful, et cetera. So that kind of fascination with the skin colors.
Okay.
And if you could address that.
So I will. Okay. Next question. I'm going to get all the questions so we can get all the questions on the table. Yes.
This will follow. It was fantastic. Thank you so much. I'll be brief. I'm assuming that you would say this statement makes sense, that other ethnic groups that have come to this country, like the Irish, for example, discriminated against but assimilated quicker because less difference in appearance, right? That would be one. You could make a comment on that. The second is a few more comments on sexism and whether you see that fitting into the same kind of Gardner scheme that you have, because even when we advance to more racial equity, I still have concerns that we're going to have a lot of inequity based on gender discrimination. Okay. And you can go into sexual orientation, everything else.
Absolutely.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Wood from Baltimore, and I want to take the pink plant and put it into the bed with the red plant, as we did when we were looking at opportunities for like the MedMar program, federal program that allowed students from high schools and colleges that were not as able as some of the other places to come to the Stanfords and the USCs and the other universities.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Weiss from Mayo Clinic, but I come with a personal perspective. So I have a multiracial adopted daughter. And so I'm curious what happens when the gardener becomes multiracial. And it isn't pink or red, but it's a hybrid of the two, and what our future is going to look like at that point and how we address those issues, as I'm trying to raise her without those boundaries, but realizing that even at 5, she understands my skin is different. There's someone that looks like me, and we're dealing with good and bad, and that's an interesting dynamic, I think.
Hi, thank you. I'm Jillian Rose from a hospital for special surgery in New York. Thank you for a peak intellectual experience, and I'm very excited, and I keep, as I listen to you, I'm so engaged in the conversation. On the intellectual level, I'm levitating, but then I'm thinking about how do I get on the conveyor belt and not be knocked over by the 150-year-old systems that are in place and not be the only one who is walking backwards. and moving towards this dynamic of moving towards the motor of what drives the system. So if you can speak to that, and how do you operationalize that within the context of those larger systems?
Hi, I'm Michael Jordan. I'm from Wellspan Health. I have a personal question. It's similar to the question that was one before mine. My wife is white, and one day when we're maybe 5, 6 years from having kids, our kids will be biracial. And we're talking about this question of what does a society that doesn't have racist views look like. And I'm kind of curious if you've actually been to anywhere on your travels that you found a physical location, a community, a state, someplace that kind of represents some of the dreams and goals that you are talking about. And what did that look like for people interacting with each other?
Other questions? Wow, so this is great. And I'm glad I did that, because even if we don't do anything but hear each other's questions, so I have half a minute to deal with all of them. So the light skin, dark skin thing raises the whole issue of that light skin, dark skin is an internalized thing from real opportunities and real, in this country, it started with the raping of enslaved black women, and then their children could be the house slaves and that kind of thing. In other countries, it has colonial histories, wherever people have gone. The reason that I even have the Gardener's Tale is because people became interested in internalized racism, and my white students especially were like, well, really, does internalized racism exist? Maybe we just need to fix that and everything will be done. And so the Gardener's Tale was just to say all of these levels are important, but what we really need to fix is the institutionalized. So the light skin, dark skin thing reflects institutionalized racism. When real opportunity and real societal valuation are no longer along those lines, then the light skin, dark skin will not happen anymore, but it's because the power structure is with the lightest right now. I have not yet read Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, but I understand that he has some insight into kind of the clash between cultures and kind of dominance over time of different groups. The Irish coming here and then being assimilated, there's actually a book called How the Irish Became White. There are many groups. All of these racial categories are constructed. Whiteness is constructed, blackness, Asianness, Hispanic, Latino-ness. People come to this country from Panama or from Cuba or, El Salvador, and then they find out that they're Hispanic, Latino, or from Mexico, and this is the new race, but we don't even want to acknowledge that we are racializing a group. So we say, oh, this is ethnicity, and then all these other groups are race. But actually, that's being racialized too. And so, so it has to do with the power structure and absorbing. Jewish people used to not be white, and now they're white. So these racial categories are fluid. Sexism, that was a very important question. My definition of racism can be generalized to be a definition of any system of structured inequity. So you could say, what is sexism? That's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And we could list out a whole list of axes of inequity that are operating. So disability status, nationality, language, all kinds of axes of inequity operating in our country today and intersecting in communities and in individuals. So I acknowledge that parallel structure. So then you might say, well, why do I talk about race as the axis of inequity and racism as the system? It's because racism is foundational in our nation's history and continues to have profound impacts on the health and well-being of the nation, and yet many people are in denial of its continued existence. So I'm lifting that up, but if we can figure that one up, then we'll have good grist for figuring out the others. Taking the pink flowers to the red bed, that is a good short-term fix, but what we need to do is not have a bad pink bed. We need to enrich all of our flower beds so that people can flourish in whatever bed they find themselves. So in the short term, I think that's a fix, but to the extent that moving to opportunity or these kinds of things take some people out of a bad situation but leaves the situation bad for others, I think that we are not doing everything that we can. The Gardner, in a multiracial situation. So I find that I call these families bicultural because there's not one pure black race and one pure white race. We're not mixing red paint and white paint and getting pink. So I even call those families bicultural. But to me, that's about bursting bubbles and people learning about other people's lived realities. And until we deal with the system that's communicating to a young child that she's not as valued or that her skin color has some kind of different valence than even as many multicultural families as we have, maybe we'll have more people who are interested in dismantling the system. How do you get on the conveyor belt alone? And this is about allies. So you have to, it's hard. If you're the only one who's going to raise your hand at a meeting and say, well, you know, say the whole word racism, people will talk about implicit bias, unconscious bias, cultural competence, discrimination. All of these are important things to talk about. But we also have to, and race, but we have to say the whole word racism, get the ism out. And so, but it's hard to be the only one who does that. And so here's my real strategy. The Gardener's Tale was published in 2000. It's 4 pages in the American Journal of Public Health. Take that paper and then distribute it to your colleagues and say, let's have a brown bag lunch about this. So then you have the discussion about it. In that discussion, you will hear, as people are talking about it, who your colleagues are that have an interest with you. You won't even know them necessarily. They may be quietly, but then you get on the outside of that meeting. So now you've identified one another, and then you can start thinking about how you can act together. We have to develop a sense of collective efficacy. And then the man who's African-American man, white wife, and gonna have biracial kids, and what are we gonna do? Again, your kids, I hate to tell you guys, and the woman with the multiracial kids, your kids, if they're not walking down the street holding the 2 parents' hands, your kids are going to have a race. They're not going to be in this country right now. So they might look white, they might look black, they might look something else, they might look Hispanic, but they're going to have a race. So we don't even, right now, we're just acknowledging sort of biraciality, but they on themselves are going to have a race. And this brings up the whole notion of socially assigned race, which is a variable that we're now measuring. The question is, how do other people usually classify you in this country? Would you say white, black, Hispanic, Asian, American, Indian, blah, blah, blah. We put Hispanic or Latino in there as a response category. But that is a reality, first of all. And then in my travels, have I seen something better? Well, I think Cuba is a little bit better, but you still see that the poorest neighborhoods are the darkest neighborhoods. It's because of the history of who came to work, the sugar canes and stuff like that. So institutionalized, as much as you might try to do things with policy and, in people's minds, we have to change structures. We have to change structures, or the legacy of these historical injustices will remain. So that was my quick responses to all those questions. Thank you very much.